Bill Maher's documentary Religulous makes many ridiculous claims. I watched the documentary about a week or so ago, and because I had nothing else to do, I could have, but I decided to watch this documentary. It was made in 2008, and what I want to do is just highlight some of the more interesting, salient points in the documentary, and then talk about them from a Christian apologetic point of view. But before I get into the critique, I really want to talk about for just a moment. You know, when I tell my students, when you're evaluating something or critiquing something, you want to bring out not just what you think is bad, but also what is good. So I do want to say some good things about both Bill Maher and what he tries to do in this documentary. I'm not Bill's biggest fan. I mean, I'm an evangelical conservative Christian, so no surprise that I'm not a follower of Bill Maher. But I do like some things about him. He a little bit more moderate and classically liberal than some of the people today who are out there having very radical views on things. He calls out his own. I think he's very fair in a lot of ways regarding that. I disagree with his overall positions, but he's more fair and balanced, it seems. He's asking good questions here in this documentary. I think if he was starting from scratch, they would be good questions. The fact that there are good answers out there makes me wonder why he's not going to look at answers in better places. But he's asking some interesting questions that Christians should be aware of, and we should be able to answer. He's very straightforward and blunt and curt a lot of times, but he's genuinely, I'll say, nice or polite to people, at least in some ways. He lets people pray for him, by the way, in the documentary, and he says nice things about some people, and so that's all good. He goes and talks to many people, and he's genuinely caring, I think, in some regards here. And he rightly calls out corruption. There's a lot of corruption in Christianity. Let's just get real. There's a lot of corruption. I've been involved in movements that were very corrupt. I was involved in the Word Faith movement, and he actually talks to people who were in that kind of movement, obviously in the prosperity world. And Bill calls him out on that. And he calls out somebody who claims to be the descendant, and therefore according to him, the second Christ's second coming through as a descendant, not in the same person. But now let's get to some of the points that he makes. Now, I think if he were just going to go around and talk to people and try to figure out, well, what do people believe? What's the average person's belief when it comes to religion? And he looks at different religions. He looks mainly at the monotheistic religions of, say, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And I'd say he focuses most time on Christianity, which is fair. Most people in the United States are Christians in terms of being Muslim or Jewish, I think, and at least I think that's the case. But he's looking at those different religions, and if he were just trying to say, what did people believe on the street, or your average Christian, your average Muslim, your average Jew, what would they believe? Then that would be kind of a fair thing to do. What do people believe? But if he's trying to look for answers to questions, which is what he seems like he's doing, then my question for him is, why are you going to people who obviously are not going to have a lot of the answers instead of going to scholars? Like, he asks a lot of historical questions, and we'll get into this here in a few minutes. And he doesn't ask any historians. He asks random people, and there's nothing wrong with that if you just want to talk to people. And he asks scientists about historical questions, but he never asks historians. So I would say, if you want a good answer, you got to get a good source for your good answer. All right. So let's look and we'll listen here. I can't play the video, but I will play the audio, and I'll try to get the audio as best I can. His first claim here is, why is believing something without evidence good?
It's a faith thing.
But why is faith good? Why is believing something without evidence good?
So the claim here is that we do, as Christians, believe things without evidence or simply on faith. And if you ask people today, if you ask people, what do you think about faith? What do you think faith is? A lot of people are simply going to say it is believing something either without evidence or contrary to the evidence. And historically, that's just not what faith has been. Faith is trusting in a reliable source. So if somebody has been established as a reliable source, and you can't verify what they're saying, then you take what they're saying on faith or trust. And for example, with Christianity, since we can prove some things historically, we can prove that Jesus lived and died through history, but we can't prove through history that his death was an atoning sacrifice for our sins, right? So why should we believe that? Because he said other things that were verified to be true and reliable. So it's not the case, as Bill says, that we're just taking things on faith or without knowing anything. Okay. So his next claim, and he's talking to a scientist, well-known, very accomplished scientist, Francis Collins, and he says, you are one of the most famous scientists who also is religious, and he makes the claim that about 95% of scientists are atheists.
Now, here's what's so puzzling, is that you are the one scientist, the one famous scientist anyway, who's also religious. Explain that to me.
Okay, so is that true? He says 93% of scientists are atheists or non-religious. Is that true? Well, I don't know what the stat is. Historically speaking, most of the majority of scientists actually were believers, and there are a lot of believers today who are scientists and believers in Jesus. So it's simply not the case that he's the only one or one of the most famous ones or the only famous one. There are a lot. We could make a list of scientists who believe in Jesus or some other kind of theistic God, or specifically even who are Christians. And so I don't think it's being very fair here. Are the majority of scientists? I don't know. I don't know what to say. But there are a lot of scientists who are theistic and also who are Christian. So that claim is a little bit disingenuous. But he makes a claim here that really took me by surprise. And he says, what historical evidence, in responding to Collins, he's asking about the historical evidence about the gospel. He said, I've never heard anyone propose that there is evidence. Listen.
That if you look at the evidence, that historical evidence of Christ's existence is overwhelming.
What evidence? I mean, I've never even heard anyone propose that there's evidence.
So what that tells me, and him saying that I've never heard anyone even propose that there is evidence, is that he's never looked for it. Because you might disagree with it, you might reject it, but to say there's no evidence is completely disingenuous and born out of ignorance. That doesn't mean he's dumb. I think Bill's a very smart person. Ignorance doesn't mean you're dumb. It means you're without knowledge. I'm ignorant of most things. I'm not an engineer, a mathematician. I'm ignorant of a lot of things, and all of us are. That doesn't mean that we're stupid or dumb. It means we're without knowledge. So I'm saying this is ignorant. And it's fine not to know or be aware of the evidence, but if you're going to make a documentary on pretty much smacking around religious people and knocking it and putting it down, you probably should do your homework first and actually look at the evidence and then go to the scholars themselves and talk to them about their own arguments and show them why the arguments are in one way or another unsound. So this is a little bit lame that Bill is going around saying he's never heard evidence, but he's making a documentary about it. And he's asking a scientist about historical questions. It's fair to ask him that, but he's not an historian. So why would you expect an historian, for example, to be able to talk to you about the Genome Project as Collins works on or something like that? So then he says a few seconds later that Jesus' existence hasn't been proven.
Proof that there is a Jesus, that's been proven.
That hasn't been proven.
So that again, that the existence of Jesus hasn't been proven is a ridiculous claim. There were a few scholars in the 1800s, and there's Richard Carrier now, who's an ancient historian who thinks that, but there are hardly anyone who thinks that, and the evidence is simply overwhelming that Jesus was an historical person, historical figure. So that's pretty disingenuous. Even we got people like Bart Ehrman, who's a very liberal agnostic, who I've heard make argumentation on the radio that this notion that there was no historical Jesus is just nonsense and does not follow the historical scholarship, either in ancient history or in the New Testament scholarship. Next, again, speaking to Collins, he says that the New Testament writers were not eyewitnesses. And surprisingly, Collins seems to allow this objection to be sustained, even though it's wrong. Let's hear what he says.
How you figured out?
When I read the New Testament, it reads to me as the record of eyewitnesses who put down what they saw.
They weren't eyewitnesses.
They were close to that. They were within a couple of decades of eyewitness.
They were eyewitnesses. So Matthew was a disciple of Jesus. John was a disciple of Jesus. Peter and James were disciples of Jesus. Mark was a disciple of Paul, who Paul knew Jesus through his interaction supernaturally. to the road to Emmaus, and Luke, Mark was a companion of Paul. Rather, Luke was a companion of Paul. Did I say it wrong again? Mark was a companion of Peter, and Luke was a companion of Paul. So they were eyewitnesses, and this is just outside the pale of New Testament scholarship to say they weren't eyewitnesses. And when Collins says that they were written within a couple of decades, well, the books were written in a couple of decades. That doesn't mean people who were from a couple of decades after the disciples wrote it. The disciples wrote these books, or people like Luke and Mark who knew the disciples. So again, if you're going to make the claims, you need to know the historical truth and proof here. And Collins isn't a historian. I don't want to knock him too much. He's not. He's probably, he did a good thing sitting down with Bill, having this conversation. He's a scientist, not an historian. And good for him to stick his neck out there, and be open about his faith in a very hostile world, because there's a lot of hostility in academia and in the world of natural science. So, good on Collins. I wish he would have had a better answer, but that's not his purview. And then why is Bill again asking a scientist about historical questions? So, but they were eyewitnesses. This is not really, at least for the ones I've mentioned, like Matthew, John, Peter, James, and Paul had his encounter, and we know that Luke talked to eyewitnesses. He talked to Paul and Mark and Peter. Mark was a disciple of Peter. So Mark is basically the gospel of Peter, and Luke is basically the gospel of Paul, with some other sources added in there as well. Okay. Then Bill says the gospels are not histories. No one who ever wrote about Jesus ever met him. Let's listen to this.
Well, Gospels are not history. Gospel writers never met Jesus. Either did St. Paul. No one who wrote about Jesus ever met him.
How can you?
What a claim. No one who ever wrote about Jesus ever met him. This documentary is interesting. It's provocative. It gets people talking about Jesus and everything, all that kind of stuff. That's good. But these claims are absurd. It's just outside the pale of ancient history and New Testament scholarship to make the claim that no one who ever wrote about Jesus knew him. Okay, it's just undisputed that these writers, especially Paul, who knew him he probably knew him during his earthly life as well, because he was a Pharisee of the Pharisees, trafficking in these circles. He would have been in Jerusalem, and Jesus was. He would have been around these areas, knowing for years that Jesus was a disruptor of the faith. And scholars recognize, and there's some dispute about who wrote different books, but it's pretty well attested that John wrote his books. At least First Peter we can give that to Peter. Second Peter is more disputed. If we look at tradition and external evidence, we believe that Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew, John the Gospel of John, and so forth. So there's a lot of historical eyewitnesses. And John says in his first epistle, then we saw him, we touched him, we heard him. Peter claims in the book of Acts that we were with him, we were eyewitnesses and saw these things. So these are just not credible claims that he is making. In speaking to Mark Pryor, who was a Democratic senator of Arkansas, Senator Pryor said, clearly the scientific community are divided on some of the specifics of evolution. And Bill's response to that was, I don't think they are. I think they pretty much agree. Let's listen.
Do you believe in evolution?
I don't know. Clearly, the scientific community is a little divided on some of the specifics of that, and I understand that.
I don't think they are.
No, well.
I think they pretty much agree.
That's just false. Especially since Senator Pryor said the specifics of evolution. There are, as the scientific community doesn't want us to know, there's a lot of variety on the various theories of evolution, about the mechanism of evolution, about did life start once, did it start many times. You've got, for example, Richard Dawkins saying one thing about the speed of evolution. I think he holds that it was really, really fast. And you got Stephen Jay Gould saying it's going really slow, like punctuated equilibrium. And they were at war with each other. So it's just not the case that scientists don't disagree, especially on the specifics. And even some scientists disagree with the whole theory of evolution. A lot of scientists who think that evolution just didn't happen. So Bill's comment there, again, demonstrates he's not familiar with the actual evidence. He does say one thing that's very interesting. He says that at one point, God is jealous, and that's such a petty human emotion. Let's listen to that.
Not moral. There's nothing moral about that. It's just something a jealous God would do.
And it does say that our God is a jealous God.
But your God is jealous? That seems so ungodlike, that God would have such a petty human emotion. I know
also-
people who have gotten over jealousy.
Okay, so is God jealous? Well, the text clearly says God is a jealous God. One thing we have to take into consideration, we're looking at the biblical text and talking about when we take a word like jealousy or anything like that, goodness, just, he has knowledge, he has justice, mercy, whatever, and we apply it to God. We have to ask the question, does the word apply to God in the exact same ways it does to us? The big fancy term for this is religious epistemology, or the normal term for it is God talk. How does our way of talking apply to God? So I think Bill has a point here, is that we don't want to say that God is literally jealous in the way that you and I are. Okay, like when we say that he is anything, that he knows or is powerful, it's not the same thing as saying that he's powerful or knowledgeable like you and I are. Now, there are some Christians who say that. So when I was on a panel with Bill Craig, for example, he said that knowledge and power, the definition there is the same for us and God. And actually, when I was in school, Norm Geiser taught this view that very much following Duns Scotus, that God, when we take a term, the term is defined the same way. I think if you pushed Dr. Geiser, though, it would make him say that there's more of an analogy there than what it sounded like. But Bill has a good point here, is that jealousy is not what you would expect from a deity. And he's right if he'd take it in a very literal sense. So God is not literally jealous in the sense that he's being affected by us. That would mean he's not impassible. That would mean he's in time, because there would be a before and after he was jealous. He would be changing. And then we would be changing him. How could a perfect being change? So it's right to say God gets jealous, but it's wrong to say that means that he does it in a literal way like we do. It's a figure of speech to help us understand how God sees idolatry, because jealousy was really part of the metaphorical language or figurative language to explain to the Israelites how God hated them going after false gods. So when we say that God was jealous, though, it makes us understand that, because we know what jealousy is. But we don't affect God the way that we affect other people like that, because he's not in time, he's perfect, he's not changeable. And so if we start saying these kind of things about God being jealous, then we make God more into us. And I think Bill has a good point here. This is one thing that I really stress. This is why I'm doing the channel, Classical Theology, is we want to maintain this classical view of God. And we can say God is jealous, we can say God gets angry, these kind of things, while maintaining, as the classical historical tradition does and did, that to say God gets angry doesn't mean that he literally changes his disposition, because that would make us affect him, and things that are lower in being don't affect things in higher in being, in this kind of order of being. He's perfect. He's not in time. If you think God changes or gets angry or gets jealous, you've got some theological problems, because then we think that God is in time. We change him. We affect him. And if he's immutable, impassible, unchanging, and eternal, then we can't do that. So it's right to say it, but it's only right to say it in a figurative, analogical kind of way. And in a few minutes after this, he also says something that was pretty interesting. He's talking to somebody. I think he's talking to the person who plays Jesus at the Holy Land Experience in Orlando. And the guy playing Jesus gives the water example of the Trinity. And Bill was impressed by that.
God.
There's two sides of the coin. He's a just God, and he's also a merciful God. He can't
No,
stand our sin,
spends
but
the
he also...
first 5 books of the Bible wiping out people.
Well, that's what he chose to do. His ways are higher than ours, Bill.
Maybe our
Sure.
thinking should be higher.
That's a good point. God has got this God-sized hole in your life. You can fit that with any position.
People.
That's true.
Isn't that a judgment there?
No,
You don't
no.
even know.
You ever had a little... Right?
Wind.
Okay, that's like the Holy Spirit.
It's a monotheistic religion, but there's 3 of them.
Just like water can be ice, steam, and water.
I see.
It's different forms, different shapes for the different purposes.
The analogy that Jesus at the amusement park said yesterday was brilliant about the Trinity is like water. It can be steam, it can be ice, it can be liquid. Wow. That is, boy, that stopped me in my tracks for it.
So Bill said this is a brilliant notion. It's a popular notion that the Holy Spirit and the Father and the Son we can make this analogy like they did about them being the three persons of the Trinity in the same ways that water can be both in a physical state, a liquid state, and a gaseous state. It's actually an ancient heresy called modalism or Sabellianism, the idea that the water can be in three different states is true, but they can't be in a state at the same time, except in a theoretical state called absolute zero. But you talk about water being physical, like an ice, and then liquid, and then a gas. They're not going to be that way all at once, and the Trinity is three persons all at once. So that's more of an example of modalism, that God takes on the mode of the Father sometimes. He's one person as the Father, one person as the Son, one person as the Holy Spirit, which is a denial of the Trinity, which says there's only one person, and he plays different parts or different modes. And the last thing I want to talk about, the last clip I want to play, this is a popular notion that Christianity has stolen ideas from other pagan mystery religions. Let's listen.
The story of a man who was born of a virgin, was resurrected. Your bio was something that was going around the Mediterranean for at least 1,000 years. We've got Krishna, who was in India 1,000 years before Christ. Krishna was a carpenter, born of a virgin, baptized in a river.
Are you saying that was written in history? That was written down in history, is what you're saying?
Absolutely.
So Bill makes these claims, and these are not new claims, that Krishna, I believe he references Osiris, Mithra, and says that these stories that Christianity teaches are just kind of stolen and taken from these other mystery religions. This was somewhat popular a few decades ago, but it's been, as one book says, and it's called The Jesus Legend. The Jesus Legend, written by Paul Eddy and Gregory Boyd, say this: the history of religions school was extremely popular. This view that Christianity stole from these religions was popular in academic circles for several decades, but owing to trenchant critiques by such scholars as Samuel Cheetham, H.A.A. Kennedy, J. Gresham Machen, A.D. Knock, Bruce Metzger, Gunter Wagner, and it eventually fell out of fashion. And he explains, how that came back into kind of popular view. So a good book on that is The Jesus Legend, as well as The Gospel and the Greeks by Ronald Nash. I'm not going to go through all the claims that are made here, except to say two broad things. One, the claims are generally speaking false. The claims that are just made, we see this with the movie called Zeitgeist, a documentary that tries to make these same claims. The claims are just, by and large, very false. For example, the claims that Horus, for example, was resurrected like Jesus, just very, very false. It was very mythical. It was nothing like Jesus. And then secondly, these things were a lot of times the claims are just, they're too late. Mithraism was post-dated for the most part. Christianity has roots earlier on. But as Ron Nash says, perhaps the most important argument against an early Christian dependence on Mithraism is the fact that the timing is all wrong. The flowering of Mithraism occurred after the close of the New Testament canon, too late for it to have influenced the development of first century Christianity. Okay, so good book, The Gospel and the Greeks and The Jesus Legend. So that's my little commentary, rant, whatever you want to call it, on Bill Maher's documentary. It's interesting. He says some interesting things, makes some interesting questions, and it's an occasion. This is one good thing about it. It's an occasion for us as apologists to be able to talk about these things and to be able to teach these points. Like, here's the claim, and then here's the response. My biggest claim with Bill is, why did he not go to sources who actually knew what they were talking about? It just doesn't make a lot of sense that you're going to go have this documentary and ask people who, even most of us have lots of disdain for the level of knowledge in the average Christian life. People that go to church their whole lives don't typically know a lot about theology, the history of the church, that kind of thing. And so why not go to this? If you're going to make a documentary and rant against religion or Christianity, why not go to the scholars who have the answers? So maybe he doesn't know about them. I don't know, but then that means you're not doing your homework. So If you want to watch the documentary, has some crude, a lot of language in it, some crudeness in it, there's some nudity in it. In fact, the label had about every category you could think of, with sexuality, nudity, language, and whatever else. But it's a good occasion for us to be able to learn how to answer these questions. So I hope you got something out of this. And like and subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you next time.